What kind of fuel can I afford in days to come? If prices rise to higher highs, it won't be petroleum. What kind of plan was this that has me stalled? Third world unfurled before I'm even ethanoled. What kind of blind caprice relied on ceaseless crude from regions under siege and glued, divided by peaceless feud? Why can't I live the rule? Alternative is cool, and maybe give mankind a mind what fuel I can.
All right. So this is the first thing that I want to say today about the assignment which is due on Tuesday. This is a first cut. Do your best. You get other chances. Don't worry about it. Just do your best and move on, which is the basic way to do pretty much anything in life. All right. Last time we talked about the origins of American militarism. We talked about the complicated conjuncture that gives rise to this phenomenon. And yesterday, after the lecture, I came across some very depressing statistics that I would like to share with you as we begin today. This is a slide that is on ERES, the slide from the lecture yesterday from the American Friends Service Committee, a very reliable source about these matters. And it shows where the money goes in terms of allocation of U.S. taxes. And notice the military in 2006 getting 41% of the total spending. The depressing statistic that I discovered yesterday was that, of course, being industrious folks, the Quakers have updated their data. And this is the data for 2009. The numbers, I'm afraid, speak for themselves. Remember last time I also mentioned the difference between discretionary spending and all government spending. All government spending is just that. But some of that spending is locked in legally. Interest on the federal debt in particular and other things. Therefore, what's left over is called discretionary spending, and it's quite clear that now discretionary spending is fully half of all the spending of the federal government. So this is something of a big deal. Additionally, we know from recent press releases that President Obama will ask for another $33 billion to fight the wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Iraq, on top of the record $708 billion for the Defense Department in the coming fiscal year. So the problem is not improving. The problem is getting worse, and it's not very hard to understand why. The Iron Triangle, first talked about in the 1960s, is very much alive and well. Here's another thing from yesterday's news, a quote from the Associated Press, in which the Defense Secretary, holding a meeting, stressing the need for closer, in order to secure a steady growth in budgets. If I had gone out there and said, could you please give me a quote that will illustrate this slide? You know, come on, give us professors a break. They could not have done better. It is a perfect illustration of this relationship between the Pentagon and contractors getting together in order to influence Congress. So that's just something I wanted to share with you so you're aware of what's going on. Last comment about that is, you may have noticed in the State of the Union address there is a call for a budget freeze. This isn't a macroeconomics class. Those of you who've taken macro will know that if you suggested a budgetary freeze and a cutting of spending during a heavy recession, you would not do well in the first midterm. But that aside, the question is what spending is going to be cut. You will notice that he explicitly excluded the military budget. He also excluded Social Security, Medicare, but that he had to exclude because, again, there are already in place laws that protect that. Only if the laws are changed, which requires something other than a budgetary appropriation, should that change. But the military budget remains there, and there we are. All right. We now need to talk about the oil business. We're going to talk about this today and next week, and we'll see, maybe we'll go over a little bit because there's a great deal to learn about this. We know why we want to know this, because if we're trying to understand this violence, we need, at a minimum, 3 different components. It's simply impossible to understand it without understanding all 3, and so that's what we're going to do. We're talking now about the political economy of oil, and in doing this, we'll employ 2 general modes, very broad brush of analysis. The first is called synchronic. Synchronic analysis is essentially analysis without respect to time. It talks about structures. It talks about demand. It talks about supply. And in most supply and demand diagrams, there is no time. Synchronic analysis is a kind of analysis that looks at the structures. For example, the structure of the international oil market. Is it a competitive market? Is it an oligopolistic market? Is it some complex hybrid of the two? How do we understand this, thinking about it analytically, deploying, above all, the tools of economics? And so we're going to talk about that. And we have to do that. We require those kinds of categories to make sense out of the history, which is what diachronic analysis is. That is, taking time seriously. So in effect, what we're going to do is build up first some synchronic concepts and understandings in the section on demand and the section on supply today and next Tuesday. And then, equipped with those tools that we gathered, a portfolio of snapshots, if you like, we're then going to run a movie. And the movie is the history of oil prices as a way of tracking developments and changes in the political economy of oil. So that's what we're doing. Now, this is a very big deal. The political economy of oil is critical for making sense out of an awful lot of things in the world because, of course, junkies are us. We are slurping down oil at a very large amount. This is a slide you've seen before, showing the explosion in consumption of oil that took place, here the red graph, over the last 60 years. In the last 2 generations, there has been an unprecedented explosion in the production and consumption of oil. So we need to make sense out of this. How did this happen? Where did it go? How do we use it? And what are the features that affect how much of it we demand? This graph is from 2000. This map is from 2003. It wouldn't be significantly different, indeed hardly any different at all today. And it's the orange that we're talking about today, consumption, rather than the gray, which is production, that I'll talk about on Tuesday. Notice, if you want to think about, well, where are the big consuming regions of the world? Well, us and our North American friends, Europe, and Asia. This is not to say that people in the rest of the world don't consume oil. Of course they do. But those are the big 3, and those are the 3 that I'm going to talk about today in terms of demand and consumption, with this particular focus, of course, on the United States. How big is world consumption? First of all, it's about, call it, roughly, 85 million, excuse me, we get a lot of 85 million barrels per day. How big is a barrel? Roughly 42 gallons. This is the way that all data in the oil business is done in terms of barrels. Now, what's in a barrel? That's not so easy to say, because oil is an extremely complicated hydrocarbon stew. It is a very chemically complex thing that varies from one place to another. And so if you ask, well, what's in a barrel? It varies with the chemical composition, with the refining efficiency, and with the patterns of final demand. A typical kind of pattern shows gasoline, you get that much out of a barrel, and so on up to jet fuel, where if you want jet fuel, you have to use a very large number of barrels. But then you can produce more than one thing at one time. So just because you know the number of barrels, you know that 42 gallons are in a barrel, that does not permit you to then say, oh, okay, so I have data about U.S. oil imports, and that immediately translates into how many gallons of gas we're using. No, don't go there. Typical product yields vary. Here's Europe and Asia on the one hand and the United States on the other, and you'll notice that we are getting more gasoline than they do typically, and that's pretty much the situation. But there are other things. Jet fuel, heating oil, heavy fuel oils, and so forth. As we'll see next time, the way to think about what happens when we talk about the production process is that there's this stuff in the ground, you have to find it, drill holes, get it out, transport it to gigantic kitchens called refineries, where this stuff in these barrels is boiled and treated in all kinds of ways to produce final products that then in turn have to be transported and distributed to consumers. So it's a very complicated business, and we need to get something of a handle on. Shares in world oil production, data is a little dated, but the bottom line is the blue wedge of a roughly 25%. As a ballpark figure, the United States consumes about 1 out of 4 of all barrels of petroleum produced on the planet. We're all, at the same time, roughly 5% of the world's population, and that's an important statistic to bear in mind. How has global oil consumption changed in the last generation? If we look at it by region, and we can see this way in which this yellow here is the rising share of Asia. And we'll talk more about that towards the end of the lecture, about that rising share. We're interested not only in the total amount of consumption globally, we're not only interested in the consumption shares of different regions, we're also interested in what regions of the world is growth of demand growing most rapidly, and that's quite clear. It's Asia. The most rapid growing demand for petroleum products is in Asia, as shown. Indeed, the sources of growth in this period, almost half, or 2 out of 5 additional barrels that were consumed were being consumed in Asia. Now, we know already, you've seen this graph before, we already know that in per capita terms, the United States and Canada, that North Americans consume an unusually large amount of fuel per person compared not merely with the rest of the world, but with other industrialized countries. And this is very important because while it might be one thing to say, well, no wonder we consume more than, say, Ethiopia, which is extremely poor, almost exclusively rural, and so forth, it's something else altogether to say, yeah, but how come we consume maybe twice as much per capita as the Germans or the Japanese? What's that about? How is that explained? And the reason for being concerned about this is that these things are not independent of policy. There are options. There are alternatives. There are roads that were not taken and that are still not being taken, but which could be taken, and which we could do something else. We have an unequal guzzling world in which there's us and then everybody else trailing off down below. Here, for example, are the Germans compared to us. Here, for example, are the Japanese compared to us, and so on. If you look at consumption per capita, notice that there's us, there's the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, no surprise there. They have a huge amount of oil. They're major oil producers. And then a few countries that actually produce other kinds of things that do this. Now, to talk about oil, we have to talk about some basic features of the commodity that are fundamental to understanding the basic economics of oil. First, in the United States, most oil, 2/3 of all oil, we'll have some graphs on that in a minute, 2/3 of oil is used for transportation. Okay? It's also used in industrial production, it's used as heating oil, and it's used to generate electricity. There have been significant, very large improvements in energy efficiency over the last generation, especially since the mid-1970s. Much larger improvements are clearly possible. Improving by reducing the demand side is much easier than expanding supplies. So if you're worried about energy security, it seems pretty clear that in the United States, by far the most effective, efficient, not to mention nonviolent way to deal with this is to work on the demand side. By and large, we have not done this. And so this requires explanation, and we will explain this in the usual way. We do a political economy analysis. We look at interests. We look at ideologies. We look at the state. We look at nationalism. We look at our role in the international system. We look at vested interests. We look at vested ideas. We do all of these things because we have to explain why it is we did one thing and not something else. Fundamental feature of making any sense at all out of the demand for oil is the economic concept of derived demand. Economics distinguishes between two kinds of demand, direct demand and derived demand. Direct demand are the things that we want for their own sake. I want food because I'm a mammal and I have to eat. Additionally, I'm a human, and so I live in a society that has certain norms and certain culture, and so I eat certain things because I'm used to that. But that's a direct demand. I want that. I want clothing because it's cold, or it's wet, or it's very hot. That's a direct demand. But derived demand is a demand for something that we want only because that thing can then be used to create something else, which is what we finally want. Okay? Consider a firm's demand for labor, which is the Econ 1 example of derived demand. The demand for labor comes from firms. Firms don't want to hire people just because they like to hang out with their employees. Right? A firm is not a party. It's not a rave. It's not. They hire the workers so the workers will produce goods that they can sell. Right? So the demand for the workers is derived from the ability of those workers to then produce the things that they can sell to generate revenue. Oil is exactly the same. There is no difference. Okay? We want oil only because we can use it to produce the things we really want. I mean, after all, think about it. Tomorrow's Friday. If those of you who go to beer halls go there, you will probably not find anybody placing an order for West Texas Intermediate Crude in a big glass. Right? It doesn't happen. People don't do this. This matters. We want oil because then we can use it to produce the things we really want. We want to be able to get around. We want to have lights. We want electricity to run computers. We want to be warm, we want to move through space, we want lighting, things of this nature. So, that means that the amount of oil we want, we don't want it for its own sake, we want it because it does things, but how oil then translates into what we want is fundamentally determined by technology. And this is a huge deal. This basic, fundamental, bedrock concept about the demand for oil is most, I think, effectively illustrated by the metaphor of Amory Lovins, who is a famous energy expert, brilliant man, lives in Colorado, runs the Rocky Mountain Institute. Cold beer and hot showers. That's what we want. We don't want the energy directly. We want the energy that then can make things cold if we want them cold, or we want the energy that can make things hot if we want it hot. And so the question is, what's the technology that goes from oil to what we really want? then becomes fundamental. In talking about oil, another thing we need, another analytical piece we need, is the idea of what does the demand function look like. There is a concept in economics called the elasticity of demand, or formally the own price elasticity, which means, generally speaking, when prices go up, other things being equal, we demand less of something. Prices tend to do this. So demand, the quantity that we demand, is responsive to a price signal. So there's a signal, which is price. There's a reaction, which is the quantity demanded. But another key question is how responsive. Right? How responsive is it? And that responsiveness is given by the concept of elasticity. Okay? If you don't know what this means, go review a basic econ book and it'll tell you. Elasticities of the demand for crude vary a lot. They vary from 1/10, which means basically that you require, if you have a 100% increase in price, you only get a 10% decrease in the quantity demanded of oil, to a 1-to-1 relationship. As usual, how responsive consumers are to price changes depends on the time allowed for adjustment. This is universally true in economics, right? And it's certainly true in the case of oil. In the short run, the typical estimates run from 2, in other words, if you have a 100% increase in the price, you'll get a 20% reduction in quantity demanded, or maybe you get a 40% reduction in quantity demanded. Long-run estimates, though, are around 1. That is, you raise the price 10% over the long run, you get a 10% decrease. You raise the price 100%, you get an even bigger decrease. And so it goes. Right? Investment is critical. Why? You already know why. Because demand is a derived demand. And derived demand means that the technology that we use to translate the crude into what we really want is critical. Changing technology requires time and it requires money. It requires, in short, investment. So investment is critical in talking about the nature of demand. It also depends, this is a more complicated idea that we'll look at when we look at the dynamics of oil prices, of expectations of future price. A good deal, as we will see, of the explosion of oil prices that happened in 2006-7 was people thought it was going to keep going up. It was going up, and they thought it was going to keep going up, so it made sense to buy it, hold it off the market, wait for the price to go up, and sell it. But if I do that, then there's less supply, and so on. So it becomes a kind of self-fulfilling process. As we will also see, you cannot talk sensibly about expectations of future price without simultaneously talking about the politics of the Persian Gulf. No politics, because that's where 2/3 of all the oil on the planet is. So, if you rattle the saber towards Iran, which is a major oil producer, if something happens in Saudi Arabia, or if there's trouble in Iraq, all of that kind of stuff will be part of what forms people's expectations about a future price. And last but not least, there is a critical role for policy here. Policy of consuming governments. It matters what we do. And this was something we'll see. Okay. So those are some just the basic econ of thinking about this. Now, let's talk about let's talk a little more detail about our oil consumption. You may have heard this complaint. Right? Let's talk about our oil use. As I've said, about a quarter of total world consumption. In 2007, it was about 20.7 million barrels a day. MBD is the usual abbreviation for million barrels a day, which is the typical unit that's used in all data about the oil industry. Notice that it's slightly lower in 2008. This had nothing to do with efficiency and everything to do with the recession. Right? Like any other commodity, oil price is one of the determinants of final demand, but incomes are also, of course, another. And when incomes fall, this falls. So this is simply a blip generated by the macroeconomic crunch, and if that crunch goes away, there's every reason to think that we will resume previous behavior. Transportation is now a little over 2/3, depends on exactly how you count, but as a ballpark figure, think 2/3 to 70% of all the oil used in the entire United States is used in the transportation sector. Furthermore, the share has been rising over time. It is also the case, as we will see, and this is fundamental to what we have to understand, the United States, which was the first oil producer, which imported trivial amounts of oil until World War II, now gets a great deal of its oil, indeed, more from imports from abroad. Imports today exceed half of total consumption. There are good reasons for this, but we can't understand why until we talk about production and until we talk about the history of the oil. Here, these data, by the way, come from the Energy Information Agency. They have a website. They're part of the Department of Energy. They have endless data, endless spreadsheets, endless graphs, as well as lots of excellent summaries of all kinds of aspects. If you're really interested in this, start browsing and surfing around in their website. So, what's happened, briefly, in the recent past? Well, consumption going up. But notice, a couple of blips. One blip here in the early 1970s, early to mid 1970s, and a second blip here. What's this blip? That blip is a price shock, and we'll talk about that price shock next week. That's a huge institutional revolution in the oil business that occurred between 1970 and 1973, and we'll talk about that. This blip is a recession. This is what can happen. In the last really big recession, we got this kind of decline, but it was also the result of policies adopted to try to use less oil. To anticipate, there was a period where we tried to improve efficiency, and those worked in some sectors, but we didn't stick with it. We abandoned them. We backed off, and as a result, oil consumption started to rise again. Notice what's happened to production. I'll talk about this next week. Production in the U.S. rose, reaches its peak around 1970, and has been in decline, roughly speaking, ever since. So therefore, imports had to go up. Here's the graph of imports. All right. So, let's talk about sectors. Notice here, the share of transportation has gone up. Already, at the end of World War II, it was over half. But now it's up to 2/3, or even now, roughly 70%. This is from the Energy Information Agency, showing this blue line being the steady rise of transportation's share. So clearly, if we want to talk about the demand for oil, we need to talk about, in the first place, transportation. And that's mostly what I'm going to talk about. I'm not going to say very much about industrial or other uses in the U.S. I'm going to focus today mostly on transportation because it's the big kahuna driving the show. So how does this work? Here's transportation. Here's industrial. Here's a few other things that are being used. But if we look at the transportation sector, what do we got? Well, we've got light vehicles, for which read cars, heavy-duty road, for which read semis, big trucks. And then we have air. You add those up, and you're right below 90%. So we're going to talk mostly about this. I mean, there are boats. Pipelines themselves require energy. There are some trains. They're not a big deal. Motorcycles are tiny. So we really want to talk about vehicles, cars, trucks, and planes. That's what we need to talk about to understand these big drivers of the demand for oil in the United States. So in the first case, we're talking about moving humans. We're talking about moving people around. It is something you may have noticed already about thinking about history, that when you make decisions in one historical epoch with one set of conditions, you then create structures, whether they're social structures or political structures, ideologies or physical infrastructures, that then are relatively difficult to change later when other conditions change. And this is true in spades for us with respect to the automobile. It is the American way of life. Here is, on the bottom left from Google Maps, the map of the state of Nebraska, which is about 700 miles long from west, east to west. The University of Nebraska is located in Lincoln, Nebraska, which is right there. And this is a photograph of the exceptionally rabid University of Nebraska fans. Don't go there and wear a color other than red during a home game. It's very bad. And people drive 700 miles each way in order to go to these games. Okay? Now, this is the way people live out there. There are huge spaces. They're entirely empty. And people do this. Oh, for that matter, after all, people are known to drive from L.A. back to the Bay Area and back with some frequency. So we're used to doing this. This is kind of the way we are. We are Motown Nation. That's us. Right? So let's think about this a little more. What are some features? Here's gallons per vehicle. And look, well, that's good. So it's roughly stable. So it's not like our cars on total are getting more inefficient, but motor fuel consumption keeps going up, and why is that? Well, vehicle registrations go up, and we're traveling more and more. And on the efficiency side of the cars, on this first thing, gallons per vehicle, notice that's per vehicle, but then how many miles? Let's talk about this. We're, of course, still the big one in terms of cars, although China is growing very rapidly in terms of demand for this stuff. And here's an interesting graph that shows U.S. gasoline consumption. Now we're talking gasoline, not petroleum, just gasoline. And notice what we get. Starting at the end of World War II, pretty much steady increase. And then a little blip. There's a set of economic forces there. And then we go up to here, because although there's an oil price shock in 1973 globally, we, in our policy wisdom, ignored it entirely, pretended it wasn't so, and so prices to American consumers remained the same until that was changed right here. And then there was a decline, combined with a recession. Things limped along like this, and then, so notice, here's this area where there were a series of forces that slowed down the growth in consumption. That's the good news. Not the recession. That's much less good news. But if anyone tells you that people are not responsive to changes in the price of oil, you can safely say to them, you should really enroll in a basic econ class, and you should really study the history of this business. In other words, to put it in less polite terms, they haven't the faintest idea what they're talking about. Okay? But then the bad news is, then there's a resumption of growth. All of this can be explained in terms of basic economics and policy and the absence of policy. This is what we need to talk about. Now, ever since Chuck Berry's famous song, famous at least to you guys in my generation, we have been riding around in our automobiles. Way back then, and again, notice, in that period where there was some decline, briefly, in consumption, that didn't mean that we stopped driving. We kept right on driving. If we were looking here at billions of vehicle miles per day, right? There's a lot. I mean, this is just think about this. We're talking, again, billions of miles a day. Like people driving, all the cars, each mile that it drives is counted as a mile. This is a lot of miles. So what about vehicle miles traveled per person? Well, I know you're shocked to discover that Americans drive more. And of course, there are many more Americans now than there used to be. So we're driving a lot. But why do we do this? Well, there's been a lot of research on this, and one summary of this research says, well, people drive for these kinds of reasons. They drive to get to work. Right? Now, if you think about that, are there any alternatives to doing that? Well, not the way where our current arrangements, but can you imagine alternative ways of doing this? Oh, yes. Can you imagine other countries where people don't have to drive so much to get to work? You certainly can. In the country of Switzerland, very large numbers of people don't bother to own a car because the rail and bus system is sufficiently good and reliable that they can go anywhere they want, anytime they want, and they don't need a car. So it's possible. Of course, you knew this was coming. We also drive in order to go shopping. Right? And again, well, why do we do this? Well, if shopping requires very vast malls that are located you have to shoo the antelope away, because they're so far out of the city. Well, then, yeah, that's what you're going to have to do, right? So, again, location. Now, there's other family, business, social, and recreational, and other. What's happened to the cost of filling the tank? Well, here's gasoline prices for the United States compared with gasoline prices elsewhere in the world. Two things to notice about this graph. First thing to notice is that the general trends are similar over time. That's because the general trends, up and down, are mainly driven by changes in the price of crude oil, which, as we will see, for very clear economic and political reasons, is inherently highly unstable. But also notice the second obvious feature of the graph, which is that we are really statistically significantly below other people. We pay lower prices for gasoline than people in all of the other advanced industrial countries. How much more and why? The answer is simple. The difference, if the trend is driven by crude oil prices, the difference is driven by policy, by government policy, to put it bluntly, by taxation. This is a useful graph that shows two things. First of all, out here at the end, it shows the different price that consumers pay for gasoline. The blue component is the price, in that particular year. This is a snapshot. The percentage of that price that's accounted for by the price of crude oil, the basic feedstock. And since crude oil is sold on an international market, which has a lot of elements of competition, there's typically one price in the world, some small differences for differences in location of refineries and things like that. But notice there's very little difference in the blue line, in the blue here. Very little. What's different is the red, which is taxation. If you want people to drive less, and it's pretty simple. People don't want to drive because they like to burn fuel. Even people who are car junkies don't like to drive just because they enjoy burning up petroleum. They like to go fast. They like the sense of movement. Maybe they like the sense of freedom, all those kinds of things. But there's no reason why those same benefits couldn't be provided by some other technology, because the demand for oil is a derived demand. Okay? Fundamental. Right? Therefore, if you tax this stuff, and then you change the price, and then if you keep that tax, over time you get differences in behavior. Why? Because consumer responsiveness to price for any commodity is determined in part by the amount of time you give them to adjust. Particularly that's true in a commodity which is demanded as a derived demand, which therefore means that technology and investment is required. All of these things take time. So if you're smart, if you're worried about heavy levels of oil consumption, as the Europeans were, as the Japanese were and are, because Japan has exactly zero domestic sources of petroleum. Zero, none, zero, zip, nada. What do? Very early, they made it very expensive to drive and tried to cultivate other kinds of alternatives. They put on a tax and they kept it there. Why is that so important? Because if this blue line is going to fluctuate all over the place, as we'll see it will, there are all kinds of deep structural features of the international oil business, both political and economic, that guarantee a high level of instability in price. If you want a price signal, then you've got to put a tax, which you legislate, and then you leave it in place. So the prices will fluctuate, but they fluctuate around, as this previous graph shows, a much higher level. And that higher level then induces the kinds of changes in which we might be interested in. Now, what kind of incentives do we have? Well, one is price, which in turn is partly a function of tax, and you can see what's happened here. Here's the black line for price. It went way up, and then it collapsed, and then it went back up again. Another way to do it is to have fuel efficiency standards for cars, called CAFE standards, corporate average fuel efficiency standards. And here we have the actual and then the legislative, and there, because it's, as usual, a complicated law, there are some differences. And notice a feature here, flatlining. Flatlining since basically the 1980s. One of the tragedies, there are many tragedies in examining blood and oil. One of them is that the United States had an opportunity in the late 1970s and early 1980s to do some things. We started to do them, and then we abandoned them. We backed off. We stopped. Okay? So that's too bad. We can't undo history, but hopefully we can learn from it. And if we can learn from it, then maybe we can do something else. So we have this problem. Here's Northampton County in Massachusetts. Municipal talking about, boy, we're eating a lot. Here it is, the development of a difference between cars and light trucks. Here's a useful graph. What about car standards elsewhere? We already know that other advanced industrial countries tax their gasoline more than we do. Oh, by the way, I should have shown you this before. Where is this? It's kind of hard to read. This is the United States right there. Second graph from the bottom. Right? Here are the Canadians. Okay? Here are the Japanese. And here are the Danes. Here's the UK. And so on. Right? Here's Norway, which is an oil exporter. Okay? So, policy matters a lot. So they have higher taxes, yes?
Back to that previous graph.
Yeah.
So the blue bar represents the price of crude oil?
Yes.
And the red represents what the additional taxes are?
Yes.
Okay.
Right. So, here are the corporate average fuel economy standards, right? Here's the United States. Until recently, now the good news is this. Here's California, proposed. And one of the things that the Obama administration did last year was to say the whole U.S. is going to start adopting, essentially, the California standard. So we've just begun, in 2009, after, essentially, a 30-year hiatus, we've begun to actually try to do something about this. But 30 years is a long time, and we've lost a lot of time. What about the European Union? Well, they're already way above us, so are the Japanese. And notice this, please. Here's China. You hear a lot of belligerent talk about, well, the Chinese are consuming more and more oil. This is true, they are. But notice that the requirements for cars in China are way more stringent than ours. Now, some of my Chinese analytical friends tell me, yeah, that's on the books. Sometimes it's not enforced, but that's not so different from the United States either. So there is this thing. Let's look at the fuel economy of the U.S. fleet. CAFE standards are applied to new vehicles. Okay? This is saying what the new car fleet has to do. Well, we don't just care about that, right? If we're interested in total volume, we do care about it because it's an important incentive. We also, though, care about the efficiency of the fleet as a whole. What does this look like? Well, it's much less impressive, right? If you look at miles per gallon, the total fleet, and again, notice something interesting, pretty much flat. Right? From the end of World War II all the way to the mid-1970s, a little bit of improvement in efficiency, but very little. Then there's a big change in this period, from the mid-70s down to the early 90s. Big change. What happened? Answer, 1, increase in price. But 2, change in policies on the CAFE standard, indeed the institution of that. And it takes time. The fleet includes cars, say, estimates say, yeah, there are lots of really old clunkers, but basically, 85%, give or take, of cars on the road are 20 years old and younger. So if you institute CAFE standards, it takes time for the capital stock of automobiles to turn over, as economists say. It takes time for the total number, the percentage of more efficient cars to grow enough that you affect the efficiency of the fleet. And that's what's shown here, in effect, is that. And then notice this. It flattens off. But that's what we'd already expect, because we've seen that CAFE standards went up, and then they flatlined. So once that happened, we had this impact that then took time to work its way through to the whole fleet, but then after that, nothing. Yeah, looking at it in miles per gallon, all kinds of fluctuations all over the place. Nice increase, huh? What happened? Increase in the price. Prices help. Then the price will come down, and we will also abandon things, and then there are fluctuations. Now, we can't talk about the recent history of this without talking about the use of extremely large cars. There are parts of the United States where these things are necessary. If you're way out in the Great Plains or in the Rocky Mountains or in the remote rural areas, if you don't have a big car that has four-wheel drive and it snows, you can die. You can freeze to death. You can be caught out there, and it's not good when it's 30 below. But you know what? The percentage of the American consumers who live in such conditions is rather small. So instead, what we do is we buy these things in order to go to the mall, which is probably not such a great idea. So we have to talk a little bit about the rise of the SUV in terms of cars, sales, and light vehicles. And notice that from a corporate perspective, the growth action was in the SUVs. How did they do this? It's pretty simple. It was a loophole in the law. The law, when they set up the CAFE standards, they had a standard for cars. The farm lobby said, whoa, wait a minute. We have to have these pickup trucks to go around, and that's not reasonable. And the farm lobby is very powerful in Washington, so they said, okay, we'll exempt light trucks. Okay, a lot of different standards. But what's a light truck? Answer, anything that's built on a light truck chassis. It isn't the whole thing. It isn't whether or not you can put stuff in the back. It's the chassis. So what happened? Take a light truck chassis, pull off the top, and put something like a car on top of it, and presto, voila, you have the SUV. That's what an SUV basically is. They are, I like to call them, seriously useless vehicles. These things are, of course, a disaster in a multiple dimensions. They're actually not even safer, but never mind. They get terrible mileage, but there you have it. They also, of course, generate an arms race, because if I'm driving a Toyota Corolla and they're driving a Ford Explorer, and we get into an accident, I don't think I'm going to do so well, and I know this, and so therefore I have to get a bigger car, and then they worry, and it's like an arms race, right? And so what's smart for one is dumb for all, as the economist Robert Frank has described, basic prisoner's dilemma game structures, and so you have that problem. As a result of all this driving and all this cars, we spend an increasing amount of time sitting in traffic jams. I know that many of you who are from down south, I hardly need to tell Angelinos about this. I have experienced this in visiting my own son in L.A., that if I want to get back to Santa Cruz, I have to get up at least at 5 in the morning if I don't want to spend my whole life watching traffic on the freeway. So there is this kind of problem, and notice that from an economic point of view, this is entirely useless. This is entirely wasted effort. So we're wasting time and burning gas. Right? The average hours of total delay has been increasing, and that's really quite a problem. Now, of course, that's not the real problem. The real problem, of course, is the old, apparently this is a myth about the boiling frog, but it'll do. The idea, of course, of contributing to carbon dioxide emissions, although globally coal is more important. In California, a majority of our emissions come from the transportation sector, that is, from gasoline. So this is not such a great thing. How do we travel? Well, we go by passenger car, we go by light truck, sometimes we fly, we don't take the bus very much, we certainly don't use rail transit, and this is a fundamental difference. Why not? Well, there are a lot of reasons. One of the reasons has to do with policy, but another reason has to do with geography. It has to do with population densities. A map is not a map is not a map. We've already been seeing that. If you look at just a map of the U.S., it's extremely deceptive because you think, well, there's South Dakota and it's big, and there's California and it's big, but you can take the entire population of South Dakota and fit them into a chunk of L.A., and so it's very different in terms of population density. That's literally true. Okay? So there are these urban corridors, right? There is an big urban area here and here. But notice this. This is called, sometimes the nickname is the Boss-Wash corridor. There's Boston, there's New York, there's Philadelphia, there's Washington, D.C., but effectively, the population density from Boston to Washington resembles that of a city. It's essentially a long, mega-urban area. And that means, therefore, it is not altogether surprising that many of the best commuter rail systems in the country exist in areas like this, or in areas like this, or in the area around Chicago, and so forth. Why does density matter? Density, if you just think about it, it's just pretty logical. Right? If you're going to build a rail system, it's going to be very expensive. Sooner or later, you have to recoup some of the revenue. You have to get revenue to recoup those costs. Now, it could be from general tax revenue. But typically, some of it will have to come from passengers. So, the viability of mass transit is, of course, therefore, in part a function of population densities. How many people are likely to take it? Now there's a kind of catch-22. If people don't take it, then it's not going to be expensive, it's not going to cover its costs, and therefore it will have efficiency problems, it won't run on time, fewer people will take it, and so on. But there are also virtuous circles. If it's in a sufficiently dense region, and enough people pay for it, and enough people take it, then there are pressures for efficiency, they have more money, it's easier to make them efficient, and so on. But basically what this shows is that if you look at a measure of density on the horizontal axis, you can see that you have to get out to, in the United States, to a fairly dense population level before the numbers of people taking mass transit begins to increase. This makes sense, right? People don't do this without this. So public transit is very much a kind of a function of density. So it matters then, long term, where we build our houses. And that's a big problem, because then, since the housing stock lasts so long, decisions made in the historical past still influence what we do now with respect to consumption. It just makes sort of standard sense. If housing units last at least 70 years, in many cases longer, then what decisions that were made on construction right after World War II still impact our demand for gasoline. This is a general feature of these things. Yes?
Do you know what the population density is at?
I don't, okay, but we can look quickly. It's relatively high. You can see we're right there. It's relatively high compared to other places in the world. And we have a functioning bus system. Right? That's part of the reason. Yeah.
Do you support the California high-speed rail initiative?
Yes. Anything that is going to reduce the amount of consumption of petroleum per capita, I'm for. New housing stock as a percentage of housing stock. Okay? Now, it's small, but again, right, every year a little bit is added, even if it's 1%. But think about it this way. If the housing stock lasts 70, 80, 90, 100 years, with obviously renovations and so on, these decisions will matter. Here's the thing. This is a useful graph. It shows how old is the housing stock relative. And notice you get to nearly 100%, way out here at like 85 years old. But then there is less of it down here. So, why do we care about this? If we have this link between the nature of transportation and oil, and then we have a second link, which is between transportation, the modality of transportation, and population density, which is in turn a function of how we build our cities, And then if we make decisions about how we build our cities that we're stuck with for a long time. And we made a lot of these decisions when the price of oil was very low, before 1970. And then we went back and ensured that when the price of oil went back down, that unlike in Europe and unlike in Japan, that high price wasn't passed on to consumers. Then we have two chunks of time, big ones, in which housing was being built under the assumption that gasoline was cheap. This is a big problem for us. We have, of course, this phenomenon, especially in the western United States, throughout the western U.S., including California, building further and further and further out from the city. This is a big problem. Now, that's the bad news. What's the good news? The good news is we know we could do much better. I mean, there are cars on the road. Indeed, I drive one of these, current Prius, and it gets, if you stay under the speed limit, you can go under 65, it gets 50 miles a gallon on the freeway and 40 miles a gallon in town. This is, to put it mild, this is at more than twice as much as the CAFE standards today, and with plug-in hybrids you get much better than that. Hybrids are a first step. Okay? It's something to do. They're getting better. Okay? Because of this idea of creating plug-ins, putting additional batteries. Here's an interesting example. Here's what you get miles per gallon with a Prius compared to the average, the fleet average, compared with a plug-in that you could get. Now, I want to stress this because this is technology that doesn't have to be developed. This is technology that doesn't require a great deal of additional investment. This is technology that exists right now. Now, if the development of new technology takes time, which it does, and if the development of new technology requires investment, which it does, which also takes time, obviously, if we can do this well right now, imagine how well we could do if we had incentives to encourage everybody in the country to do something differently from what we're doing right now. Over time, we could see a huge change. How did Toyota do this? Well, it's interesting. This was a political economic decision. It was the decision of a company, to be sure, but it was also a decision by the Japanese government that said, we want these. So they formed a team of engineers. It was small at first, and it kept growing until there were over 1,000 of these guys. Highly trained people working in different components, trying to figure out how to make a car that's still a standard kind of car, looks kind of the same, and would get dramatically better mileage. They produced 80 designs, complete designs, way more component designs, that failed until they finally got the actual design. Now, there's no reason why the United States automobile industry couldn't do this. There's no reason why the American government, in consultation with Detroit, couldn't do something like this. The problem is, vested interests and vested ideas have blocked this. But that could change. Right? The key was the manager kept insisting, we will double the mileage. Getting 25 miles a gallon now, not good enough. You've got to get 50. Do it. And they would come back and say, no, this only gets 35. Not good enough, go back. And then they tested it. Starting in 1997, they only sold it in Japan for 3 years. They put the car in the hands of some of the world's most demanding consumers, Japanese consumers. And then they used this to get more information, right, and to get correct design flaws, and so on. Hybrid sales have been going up of all kinds. Toyota's only one. There are lots of others, and that's good. But as a percent of total sales, it is a complete sideshow. Right? You wouldn't think that if in Santa Cruz sometimes, there are all these little Priuses driven around by all these professors and engineers who work over the hill, and But in other parts of the country, trust me on this one, having recently been there, you will see many fewer. Okay? It's not helpful that they're as expensive as they are, but it matters. Why? There is a notion about how much of this demand, this is the same kind of graph from the same source as before, from a sort of oil analytical site called the oil drum, where they were looking at, this is this increase in millions of barrels of gasoline per day being consumed. And we've seen this part of the graph already. If we do business as usual, this is what we're likely to get. There are many reasons that you will know all about by the end of this class why this is unsustainable. Those of you at 141 know one side of why that's unsustainable. Now you'll learn about its unsustainability in political terms and possibly even in geological terms, although that's a big debate. But it's clearly a bad idea also in terms of global emissions. But the good news is, if you do two things, if you get dramatic improvements in auto efficiency, this could happen. You could get the green line. If then vehicle miles traveled per person simply remain constant, we're not talking about Americans driving less. We're talking about Americans not increasing the amount they drive. Then you would get a little additional wedge in here between the green and the blue lines, and you would get this kind of decline. Now, people will say, well, would be very expensive. This would require a lot of change in how we do things. Yes, but as we will see, invading countries that dislike us with radically different cultures that are very likely to try to blow up our young men and women is also a very expensive proposition. And this is really the choice. If you want more details about this, this is by Amory Levin's team called The Oil Endgame. That URL is already on eRes. The slides for this lecture are on eRes. You can check it out now. So efficiency matters. Now there are skeptics. There is a skeptical view. And the skeptical view says, efficiency, man, doesn't work. This is a very old debate. It goes back to this man who wrote a book called The Coal Question. His name was Jevons. He was a famous economist, one of the founders of neoclassical economics. And way back in 1865, when talking about coal consumption, he said that even though England was installing more efficient machines, coal consumption kept going up. So this became known as the Jevons paradox. Even though the machines get more efficient, he said, it's still the case that you get more of this. And this is called the rebound effect. This is what Jevons said, that this isn't true. Now, there's actually, sometimes he's right and sometimes he's wrong. And modern economics can very easily distinguish between them. It's a difference in price elasticity. Okay? The Jevons paradox says that demand for fuel, right, you get improved technology, which gives you more. But even so, the quantity demanded rises, but sometimes you get something else. Here's an example. There doesn't seem to be a William Jevons in our refrigerators. No William Jevons. Open the door. Guy with a beard. Energy use per unit of refrigerators. Notice what happened. Big increase. But then, even though refrigerators got bigger, now you can almost play basketball inside them. Big decline. Major improvements in the technology. Size keeps going up. Price goes down. So notice this. It's possible to get more efficient, have the size go up, and have the price come down. Again, people will say, oh, we can't do that. We can't have greater efficiency. It would cost too much. The prices would go through the roof. Maybe, but maybe not. It all depends. There's another sort of by two economists basically saying that if you get greater improvements at the micro level, this creates more, then people have less to spend elsewhere. They spend things on other things that then generate additional demand for energy. So this is really a restatement of the Jevons paradox, and basically is the contention that at the macroeconomic level, it's economic growth rather than price that drives demand. Now, the Kansas City Fed has this graph that says, yeah, well, if you get richer countries, you get this increase. But we've already seen some reasons to be kind of skeptical about that. Because it's not like Japanese and Europeans live worse than Americans. And we already know they consume a lot less of this stuff than we do. So, sure, if you're talking about relatively poor countries down here, yeah, then there's going to be more oil consumption. But it's not so clear. There seems to be a lot of variation around this trend. So here's some issues. Empirically, most people think this rebound effect does not offset the price increase. So basically, we think the Jevons paradox is unlikely to be a problem. This is particularly true if governments use other policies because, again, of the critical role of derived demand and investment over time, how these things can shift. It also is the case that if you get increased efficiency, this can be politically useful. People may complain about various things, some people may lose out, but if there's improved efficiency, this may make some people more happy. As an economy, we have become more efficient in our use of energy generally. Why care? Well, again, because we want to think about ways in which we can do this, and it's got to be politically feasible. So if we've done it before, why can't we do it again? Answer, no reason we could. It's a function of policy. Globally, here's the U.S. Again, the ratio of oil use to total output has been going down. Now, there's good news there and bad news there. One of the good news is obvious. It means we're using less of it. But the bad news is that the less economically central oil appears to be, the less attention, political attention, that gets focused on these issues, and thus it can be harder to get change through the legislative process. If you look at the energy expenditure share, total, petroleum, natural gas, you get a similar kind of thing. Over a longer period of time, you can see how consumption or production of energy in the U.S. has gone down. It's a graph from my book with John Waterbury, which shows, again, notice what happened. Change and then flat. Change and then flat. Why? Oil price changes and policy responses in the 70s, and then backing off later on. So that's the movement of people. There are lots of possibilities for doing things differently. It is a derived demand. Technology is all important. People are responsive to price, and government policy is a critical component of that price. And therefore, if we don't have those incentives, one of the places we want to look at is what happens with policy. What about moving goods around? How do we do this? Well, we burn oil to do it. Heavy-duty trucks are central to this whole business. Let's talk a little bit about the trucking industry. How does this work? Well, maybe 16%, reasonable guess, of total oil consumption is accounted for by the trucking industry, which really means the semis. Okay? There are smaller trucks are also there, but it's really the semis. These trucks move, depending on how you count, we'll look at two different measures in a moment, about 70% of all the goods being moved around in the United States. On average, these vehicles travel 5 times as far as the average car. That makes sense. We drive to get to work. We drive to go visit relatives and friends and things like that. They drive to move things from the West Coast to the East Coast, from Chicago to Texas. I mean, this is part of the whole transportation business, moving goods all over the country. So it's not surprising that they drive very much. And as basic physics would suggest, since these things are so enormously heavy, obviously you need more energy to move things around, and that's right. They get about 5 miles a gallon, okay, as on average, those gigantic things. Okay? What's their share? Well, okay, this is the share in moving goods by weight. Right? Total weight of all stuff in the United States being moved around. The trucks account for just under 2/3 of it. Now, this is, in a way, part of the failure of the rail industry and some of our difficulties. The marine vessels has to do with our geography. If you look at it by value, it's not surprising at a higher percentage. And this is because often higher value products may be perishable, they may require greater speed, and trucks, again, can do this. Now, here again, this is an illustration of policy. You know, policies, sometimes little simple things can matter, and we don't pay much attention to them, and we don't think about the consequences. Consider speed limits. Let's talk about speed limits and what they do. If you slow down a fully loaded semi from 75 miles per hour to 65, you increase the fuel efficiency by over a quarter. Now, if you think about it, you got 16% of fuel consumption. That's a significant reduction. But what's the problem? The problem is that in less populated parts of the country, the speed limit on the interstates is 75. On I-80, basically, all the way from Chicago to Reno, with a few exceptions, it's 75 miles an hour. So the other problem is, what does this do? If you drive things very fast, the engines, of course, wear out sooner, the tires burn up quicker, and therefore, if you drive more slowly, there is saving on the depreciation of the trucks. By the way, this is not data from some bunch of hippies. This is data from the ATA, the American Trucking Association, okay, which is the industrial representative of various trucking firms. It's the trucking lobby. Okay? So, therefore, it would be profitable to the trucker industry to have a 65 mile an hour speed limit, but it doesn't happen. And why not? Because, once again, we've got a prisoner's dilemma game situation. We've got one of these smart for one, dumb for all, as Robert Frank, the economist at Cornell, has called it, that if you reduce the speed for trucks, but you leave the cars alone, then you've got the cars weaving in and out of the trucks, you increase the danger. That's why there's typically a uniform speed limit. I know that sometimes there's a slower speed limit for trucks. They've been experimenting with this. But this is why the ATA wants to have a reduction in speed limit. Why doesn't it happen? Because of pressures from us, from ordinary drivers, from people who don't like the idea. Why must we have this kind of slow thing? I mean, you can notice this. Try as an experiment, if you're from down south and you drive down I-5, try the experiment of seeing what MPG you get if you drive 65 and stay in the right-hand lane. As opposed to doing the speed limit, which is often 80. Just try it. It generates an interesting result. Okay? So this is another example. Really simple policy. Speed limits. And what could be more simple than that? Right? Anyone who can add can figure this out. Right? And so here again is a kind of possibility for going. Now, this shows you the kind of volume this is a graph of traffic by volume. And it's not surprising. It's the big interstate network. That's one of the things it was designed for. And you get a lot of this kind of trucking traffic. You get large-scale shipments out of Long Beach, the biggest port on the West Coast, and you get this kind of shipping all over the country as a result. Now, it's interesting to look at Canadian experience. Canadians have seen improvements. Okay? Even though the trucks are being driven more, the energy intensity has been going down. This is not because Canada has shrunk. It's even bigger than we are, right? Even bigger distances. But because of a series of policies that have encouraged the reduction in efficiency. So again, if we're worried about efficiency, we worry about policy and technology and incentives. This is the standard way to try to improve it. Air travel. This is a very big deal. This is one of the air routes, which are barely visible in this graph, in the 1930s. Hardly anybody flew. You had to be really rich or sort of part of the government. And then, of course, it has exploded. What's happened to world air travel? Again, a little blip there, everyone 9/11, so people get very nervous. And then it resumes its upward trend. Here's a graph taken from the Department of Transportation statistical base that shows the increase in U.S. air passenger miles, and it's been going up. Now, why do we care about this? Well, 30,000 flights a day. That's a lot of flights, folks. Notice this. It takes about 10 gallons of crude oil to make a gallon of jet fuel. 77 gallons per person to fly from New York to LA. So a New York to LA flight basically requires 770 barrels of crude oil. That's a lot. Okay, excuse me, gallons of this stuff. It is about 13% of total global transportation emissions. Prices have been going up, but the responsiveness of consumers to this is pretty low. There isn't very much. No one has a very good idea what to do about this, because although there are all kinds of substitutes for automobile fuels that are based on petroleum, no one has yet come up with any substitute for jet fuel for traveling that fast. Okay? Just because the potential energy in fuel, jet fuel, is so high, no one has as yet been able to figure out a substitute for that. So really, the action comes on when do people fly and when do they not. That becomes the kind of policy area. I couldn't be in the Environmental Studies Department and not mention agriculture. Right? It costs quite a lot of oil to feed us, and that's for some obvious reasons. Farm machinery is everywhere, as well as then there is transportation required for this stuff. Here's an estimate from some agricultural economists at Iowa State University trying to figure out the percentage of energy use where it goes in different places. There are a lot of computational issues that bedevil these kinds of calculations, however. They have to do with direct energy use and indirect energy use. A lot of British economists have looked at this, and there's a big debate about where you stop in terms of thinking about agricultural energy use and where you start, but long-distance eating clearly uses a lot. If you look at sort of locally grown as opposed to grown far away, by one measure of the kind of miles being used, it matters. We do have buildings that need to be heated. And in the East Coast and Midwest, a good chunk of those buildings used to be heated by fuel oil. Many of them still are, but this has changed. This was one of the big sources of improvements in energy efficiency nationally in the 70s and 80s. The percentage of households, again, using this, not much different by household income. Electricity by petroleum has declined. That's nice, but this is extremely unnice. The fact that we are increasing the amount of use of coal, which is, roughly speaking, twice as potent a greenhouse gas per unit weight burn as oil, is not good news. So this again suggests something to be concerned about. It's not going to work to just focus on oil consumption if your concern is global climate change. You must deal with carbon itself. You must deal with those emissions. If you don't, and you just increase the price of oil, that creates an incentive for people to switch over to coal, which is exactly what we observe in this period here. When there are these incentives, people switch over to coal, and that may be good from a point of view of reducing the demand for oil, but it's terrible from the point of view of its impact on the environment. We know that there's this steadily rising import share. We know this is what it looked like in 2007. Remember the slide from earlier in the lecture? It's already over half, and we're only 2 years later. Okay, that previous graph was 2009. So there is an increase in import share. This has been going on for some time and is very unlikely to change. Where does it come from? Contrary to popular belief, most of our imported oil does not come from the Middle East. So right away, you know that one way in which oil matters is not our purchase of it directly. It matters some. But it would be difficult to make an argument that if we get about 1 out of 5 of our imported barrels, which is really only a little over half, from the Middle East, why do we care so much? it can't be just the security of the supply to the United States itself. Now, can it? It doesn't make sense. Okay? This doesn't mean that the Middle East doesn't matter to the oil business. It matters hugely. We'll find out why next week when we talk about the conditions of supply and what is it on the supply side that fundamentally determines the price. But nevertheless, it's important to look at this because we want to get this right. We want to understand in what way does consumption of oil and our addiction to oil plug in here to the Middle East. And it doesn't appear to be just that, well, it's obvious, we get all our oil from those people. Not true. We don't. Okay? Not only do we not get all of our oil, we don't get most of our oil. We don't even get most of our imported oil from those people. So we care about that. Instead, we get it from lots of other places. We get it from the Canadians. We get it from the Mexicans and the Venezuelans and lots of places all over the world. Why did our imports boom? Pretty simple. This is U.S. production. It goes up, and then it comes down. We'll talk more about that and that model of the rise and decline, the bell curve of oil production in the U.S., and some more recent attempts to ask, could the American pattern be true globally over time? And so, obviously, then, imported share goes up. Who gets the money of our spending? Well, sure, that's maybe. A quarter of it goes to Arab OPEC, including Saudi Arabia, which is typically, as a government, friendly to us. A bunch of other folks. Other members of the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, which includes Venezuela, get this. And then non-OPEC countries get about half of it. So if we're worried, so we're worried about oil, and we're worried about the Middle East, and we're worried about these people that may not like us so much. And then we say, well, it's because we're buying all our oil from them. And we discover this isn't so. It's just not true. And then we say, well, maybe we're worried about it because there's all this money that's flowing into them, and then they're going to use it to do bad things to us. Well, first of all, are they getting all the money? Well, yeah, some of them are getting money. But a lot of them have nothing to do with OPEC, are also getting money. And then we, of course, have to ask, well, just because they're getting money, does this mean they want to do bad things to us? We'll get to that later on. Okay? So again, what do you notice here? Notice the old story, the emperor has no clothes, right? You know that story, Hans Christian Andersen fable? There is an enormous amount of utter rubbish that is babbled on the airwaves about the oil business. People talk about controlling oil. People talk about the necessity of this and that. But once you start really analyzing the nature of this global market, and the patterns of demand and supply, you will see that an awful lot of what is said is simply rubbish. Persian Gulf is important, but it's not important for its direct supply. Projections are that we are likely to continue to depend on imports. So that's the basic, simple story about the demand for oil in the United States. The demand for oil is, however, this is a global market. So we need to talk about other parts of the world, like the European Union, the second largest consumer of this. They consume about 15 million barrels a day, compared to ours, roughly 20 million barrels a day. Oil is about 40% of the energy use, which is interesting. 2/3 of it is imported. The other third comes from Norway and the North Sea. As we've seen, people in that vast economy and region pay much higher prices. This is very useful to know. The core of the EU, what does this mean? This means countries like France and Germany and Italy and the Benelux countries. These countries consume less oil, not just less per unit of GNP, less oil, full stop, despite considerable economic growth. This is an encouraging sign. And the governments play an active role in energy conservation and have since the founding of the European Union. What is the European Union? Well, there it is in blue, plus other recent admissions like Romania and Bulgaria. Big debate about whether Turkey will join. It's basically Western and Central Europe. Where do they get their energy? Well, here's the oil share. They get it from natural gas. They get a big chunk of it from nuclear. Most of the electricity in France comes from nuclear power. Right? I don't have a lot of strong opinions about nuclear power. It makes me nervous. I always wonder about the half-life of the stuff of the garbage, but on the other hand, I worry a great deal about things like global warming, so I worry about that as well. Here's the renewables. Hydroelectric is big, so this is what the Europeans are doing. Here are the big consumers, not surprisingly, the big economies, the ones with large populations. And this is a very interesting graph that shows their consumption per day. Here we are way back in 1980. Look at that. And German consumption has never since gotten to the level that it was. Now, Germany, I don't know if any of you have been there, but if you ever go there, you will discover Germans are not poor. Germans live very well. Right? They have an advanced industrial economy just like we do. So again, things are possible. Of course, the conditions are different there, but still, it's possible to do this. And notice the same thing is true of the French. Rather less so, perhaps, but again, even the Italians, not doing so. I say even the Italians because their government is widely recognized as much less efficient and much more corrupt than the German government. But even there was a possibility of not dramatically increasing their total energy use. The smaller countries, some increase. Those smaller countries were much poorer to begin with. And why is this? Because as you learn in the first week, or maybe the second week in Econ 1, demand curves slope down. That is to say, if you increase the price, the quantity demand falls. And they have relatively higher prices. This is just a kind of rerun of the previous graphs showing the higher prices that they pay. And this shows oil imports as a percent of oil consumption. It fell here. The answer is a simple explanation. It fell because, notice, this is combining the EU and Norway. And two new sources of petroleum were discovered in this period in the North Sea. The Norwegians had most of it, but the British had some, and the Dutch had some. So there was production, but the signs are that that production is flattening out. And so it looks like, most predictions are, that the dependence of Europe on imports will rise. This matters because then they become more concerned with sources of oil and where they get it. So where do they get their oil? Well, they get a big chunk of it from OPEC countries. Okay? So they get more of their oil. Okay? They get a big chunk of it, and particularly from the Middle East, but they also have another source of supply, Russia. Russia has a huge amount of oil. Indeed, some, depending on the year, Russian oil production is the largest in the world. Okay? The Russians have been trying to build a whole series of pipelines, both for petroleum and for natural gas, and use them as a way to supply Western Europe. Now, there have been a lot of political issues about this because some of these pipelines go through Ukraine, which became an independent country. There's a lot of conflict between pro-Russian types, indeed ethnic Russians in Ukraine, and other Ukrainians, and that leads to disputes between the government of Ukraine and the government of Russia. So the pipeline gets interfered with, it gets turned off, and the people in Western Europe don't have any gas, and things get cold, so this is a problem. So they have two policy responses. One is to be nice to the Russians. Try, beating up on your main energy supplier is probably not a wise policy, and they don't do this. But also, they're trying to hedge their bets. But how do you hedge your bets? You hedge your bets by getting your oil from elsewhere. Elsewhere means from the Middle East. So there is this increasing shift in that direction. How did the British cope with all this? They call it motor spirits. Right? We call it gasoline. And we show it goes up and then comes down. So here's the fuel oil industry, dramatic decline. And notice, their population grew and they got richer. So again, if populations grow and incomes grow, two of the determinants of demand. But quantity demand goes down, that something else is going on, and basic economics tells you that this is driven by incentives, that there were incentives to promote investment and to promote technological change so that the derived demand for this stuff fell, so that people could continue to get what they really wanted, but that they didn't have to go through the old system. Demand projections, however, show that there will be increases globally, both in Europe, okay? This is for energy. But where do you get the energy? There are lots of options. World oil demand. Now, you get a lot of projections. This is maybe the least realistic. This is from Exxon. Exxon, of course, said, they're in the business of selling crude, so they say, well, there's going to be this huge increase in the demand for oil. And these kinds of projections are, quite frankly, not very interesting because they typically neglect price, which therefore annoys all economists, and they also ignore the potential of technological change and policies, so they're really not all that interesting. But notice, some people think, like very powerful oil company executives, Exxon is the biggest corporation in the business, that the demand is going to go up. Now, if those people think the demand is going to go up, then they're going to want to say, well, how do we get our hands on sources of supply to meet that demand? And if they're then well connected with certain political forces, this could be a way, indirect way, in which oil may have some influence on U.S. policy. And we'll want to think about that at some length later on. What about Asia? Let's talk about Japan first. All the oil in Japan is imported, all of it. Like the Europeans, today, 30 years later, they are using about the same amount of oil that they used in 1980. And their population has risen and their incomes have also gone. They have low consumption, given how rich they are, and no surprise why. The government policy. And the government has been systematically working on this really since the end of the American occupation under MacArthur. Ever since there was a reconstituted independent Japanese government, they've been working on this, trying to find out ways to use less of this stuff. They have been getting richer, but not consuming more. This shows the time series over time, and this kind of flattening out, some increase and then going down. It's useful to contrast us with them, right? Very little change. Right? So again, the message emerges once again. What government policy is, what incentives are created, is fundamental to what the final demand happens to be. Now we got to talk about some really big players. Not so big yet, but certainly, almost certainly, huge players in the future. What? The so-called, who wants cars? Well, in relatively poor countries, in China, despite its dramatic changes, remains a relatively poor country. It's people, kind of middle-class people. Maybe 20% of the total Chinese population. And since the Chinese population is roughly 1.2 billion, that's a lot of folks. With continued economic growth, that percentage could rise to 40% of the Chinese population by 2020. So if you think about this, you can see that there is a gigantic, you're potentially adding an entire America of 300 million people, of consumers of cars. This is huge. This is a huge thing to think. This would still be the estimates of the middle class in the U.S. are around 60%. The threshold that most economists use is about $3,000 in purchasing power parity dollars. That's an economic term. It just means you've controlled for differences in purchasing power in different countries. That's roughly the threshold where people start buying cars. They got to have at least that much income. Right now, there are about 250 million people in China. That's actually probably an underestimate because it grows every year. And in India, it's about 300 million. And again, the population of the United States is about 300 million. So we're talking about huge increases in the number of people who are likely to want a car. And we've already can see some of this. Here's China plus India's increase in oil from 1987 But basically, during, let's ballpark figures, during your lifetime, you can see what's been happening. Huge increase in demand coming from this. I mean, to go back to this, maybe what's going on in Asia simply because, once again, fundamental fact about the world, half of all human beings live in Asia. And so this is the biggest great transformation ever in history. It's huge. And Chinese per capita output has been going up steadily. Okay? This is a huge deal. And it's a very good deal. There are all kinds of difficulties with it, but one thing that you need to know, again, a fundamental feature of modern history is this. What's happened in the last generation in China is the largest fall in poverty, and I mean really grinding poverty, where people are miserable, that's ever occurred in human history. This is huge. This is a big deal. From the point of view of trying to minimize basic human suffering, this is a big deal. And it has flip sides because history is complicated. And because as these people get richer, as this mass poverty of millions upon millions of people decline, there is this very large increase in the derived demand for oil. Given that we certainly wouldn't want these people not to become not poor, we certainly would applaud the improvement in their living standards, we therefore really care from a global perspective about ways that they, like us, can get what they finally want, which is heating and lighting and electricity to run computers and the ability to move themselves in space. Those are the final demands. We want to make sure that that does not translate into an equivalent increase in the derived demand for petroleum, because otherwise there will be trouble. For no other reason than that would ensure dramatic increases in global carbon emissions. So we must, for all kinds of reasons, have the kinds of policies in this country, in Europe, in Japan, in China, everywhere, that seek to give people incentives to do things differently, that give firms incentives to make different kinds of investments, that give entrepreneurs incentives to create a different kind of technology. Consumption of oil is booming in China. There is every reason to imagine this will continue. Their dependence this is the projection for business as usual. There are huge auto shows in Beijing and Shanghai and all the major cities in China. Motor vehicle registration, look at that. Kind of a classic exponential growth curve going up. Okay? And they have traffic jams to go along with it. Right? Huge ones, just like us. Right? So rapidly having a marked impact on the world commodity market. And in fact, most projections of Chinese demand, if you look back at what people were projecting and what actually happened, they were typically underestimates, that the actual increase was greater than what people were saying. Here's the U.S. automobile zone per 1,000 people. Here's China. Notice they're converging to our pattern. This matters. And some people say, well, then this is going to happen. Because there's this thing about oil, then we're going to have conflict with the Chinese. Again, well, only if you ignore economics. Only if you have policies that ignore the derived demand feature of the demand for petroleum. Then and only then does this kind of notion make any sense. And of course, there are all kinds of other reasons why this would be a global disaster for everyone, and it's all in our interest to avoid this. So note this as well. If you're interested in the prospects of global peace, surely one of the necessary conditions for this is continued decent relations between the United States and the People's Republic of China. This is a necessary condition. It's not sufficient, but it's necessary. If you think there's a source of conflict, which there are some over petroleum, which is located in the Middle East, this is another reason for removing that source of conflict, and we know one way to do this is by focusing on the demand side here. Would be a good thing to do. Furthermore, There's another very large country, by some population projections soon to become even larger than China's population, which is doing much the same. There has been an increase in their incomes per capita, and this has, again, translated into an increase in demand. And those are just the two biggest countries in the world, but we could go on to talk about the whole world. And there are lots of people here who still, on average, have very low incomes per capita. Ordinary, simple garden variety justice requires that these people and these people live better than they do now. And that requires increased energy use. That's yet another reason why we over here need to start doing more of what they do here and here, to start coming up with policies that might do something. China has grown very rapidly, but if you look at sort of estimates in the UN of poverty, and we're not talking about low level, this is really serious poverty, it's still widespread, which is what any Chinese planner will tell you that this is the problem. If you look at the shares of wealth in the world, here we in North America, Europe, and the rest, so it's a highly unequal world. There is growth here, so this is the bottom line. Okay? Rising incomes around the world, especially in relatively poor countries, mean rising demand for energy. Rising incomes also means rising demand for transportation, including cars. You can't get there from here without large-scale conflict, which derails everything, which kills people, which is utterly useless and pointless, unless you enhance efficiency. It's not just a good idea for the environment, although it surely is. It's not only a good idea in terms of saving money, which it certainly is, but it's also fundamental to world peace. We need to do this. So the steadily growing demand for oil will put upward pressure on prices unless there is change on the demand side, and contribute to international competition for access to oil unless there is action. And so far, our response in this country has been this. Here's Donald Rumsfeld, right after 9/11. Either we change the way we live, or we change the way they live, and we choose the latter. Happily, this gentleman no longer occupies high office. Yet, because the structures, as we saw, for example, in the last lecture of these things, are far stronger than any one individual, any one president, any one secretary of defense, this mindset remains a threat. This is it, folks. This is the choice. We can either work on efficiency, or we could say, yeah, well, no, let's just get the wars about it. This is entirely unnecessary in every way. Okay? But we need to know more about why. We could choose differently. Okay? So we'll talk more about this, and have a good weekend. On Tuesday, we'll talk about the economics of supply.